Harriet Tubman was a Black woman in a time when her gender and race made it extremely difficult for her to gain autonomy and agency, but she would not back down. She stood toe-to-toe with the Goliath-sized evil of chattel slavery, and she helped smuggle African Americans out of slaveholding states into freedom. She escaped her own slaveholders in Maryland and fled more than 100 miles on foot by herself to freedom. And her escape, it almost killed her, but Harriet lived, and then she spent the rest of her life freeing other slaves. Harriet Tubman made 19 trips to the South and freed 300 slaves. And Frederick Douglass boasted she never lost a single passenger. Harriet's unrelenting passion and fortitude shocked even the most committed abolitionist. How did Harriet stay brave? Harriet was a devoted Christian woman who believed she heard the voice of God. She was convinced that his presence was guiding her on each of her 19 trips into enemy territory, and she attributed her safety of all of her passengers to God's protection. Nothing rattled her. And after Harriet completed her last rescue mission, she served as a spy, scout, and leader in the Union Army in the Civil War. And according to Women's History Museum, she was the first African American woman to serve in the military. I believe it. We should put Harriet Tubman's picture next to the dictionary's definition of brave. Harriet should have died at a young age after suffering terrible abuse at the hands of her slave masters. She should have died in her escape. She should have died during any of her rescue missions. The odds were always against her every step of the way. And I wonder if you ever feel like the odds are against you. You've been given a medical diagnosis with no cure. You feel like someone you love is living on borrowed time. Or maybe you're the first in your family with aspirations to go to college, break out of the cycle of poverty, own a home. Maybe you're a person of color, defying the odds of systemic injustice and the demonic stronghold of racism. Whatever giant you face, bravery might feel too hard or exhausting. But I want to encourage you. You might be in a valley that requires staying brave, but opposition is part of the human condition. And so whatever your odds, you're going to find encouragement today in the valley of Elah. In your previous video, you got to see how Deborah was an outlier among Israel's judges. And there was a governance in the way the world worked for Israel at that time. But God's people grew tired of corrupt judges, and they asked for a new form of government, a monarchy. And in the Old Testament books of 1st and 2nd Samuel, 1st and 2nd Kings, 1st and 2nd Chronicle, we learned that the Israelite monarch had its advantages, but it did not come close to God's kingship. And so the monarchy created a season of stability for God's people, but ultimately, it was still a failed system of leadership. All forms of government fail. And the monarchy exposed that the people of God needed a king of all kings to rule with justice and love. Of all the Israelite kings, King David was the best known ruler of Israel. He was the baby of his family and grew up as a lowly shepherd tending his flocks. And if you're not familiar with the King David's story, Rise to Power, the whole story is fascinating and you should check it out. But we're going to zoom in on one encounter David has with a giant named Goliath in the valley of Elah. You're going to read in the Bible study that we provided for you that David stayed brave when the odds were against him. He found himself facing Goliath in the valley of Elah, which was a place of great opposition and difficulty. And things looked pretty bleak for David. And his focus was on the strength of God instead of on the giant. And one thing I want to point out to you before you go and work through the Bible study yourself is that during this battle for faith in the valley of Elah, Goliath the giant intimidates and insults David and defies God. Perhaps someone in your own life has spoken harmful words over you. Maybe you've been told you're nothing, you're worthless, you're a mess, you're hopeless. And your bullies, they weaponize your deficiencies and then they conjure up lies. Whatever their tactics, their words can be broken record in your mind. And they replay that you're too much, you're not enough, you're unwanted. And I want you to take heart. King David knows your pain. He shows us what it is to ignore the shouts and lies and to trust God for the victory. With God's power, you can too. You can stay brave. And here are 3 ways to do it. Stay brave when your naysayers try to intimidate you. One of the taunts Goliath voices to David is, "Why do you come out and line up for battle? Am I not a Philistine and you're a servant of Saul?" Goliath tempted his opponents to believe that they were nothing. Who do they think they are? Don't they know that the great Philistine warriors always win? I want to encourage you to stay brave when your naysayers get loud. They're lying about your identity. You are a child of the Most High God. Also want you to stay brave when naysayers try to defy God. Goliath dares to defy God by saying his people will be defeated. And that fight against the giant, that's not what happened. Goliath didn't understand that their God was far more powerful than he would ever be. So I want you to stay brave when your naysayers get loud with impossibilities. You see, nothing is impossible for your God. And number 3, stay brave when naysayers try to insult you. Goliath says to David, "Am I a dog that you would come at me with sticks?" Goliath bullied David, trying to get him to believe his weapons were useless and pitiful. What is the stick fighting a giant? And maybe that's how you feel about your education, your experience, your level of power. I want you to stay brave when your naysayers get loud with put downs. Your best weapon is following God into battle. Every single one of us lacks something we need to win our fight against the enemy. David lacked experience, height, armor, a shield bearer, the support of his family, and even the example of his own king. What do you lack? Energy, money, health, wisdom? It wouldn't be a valley battle if the stakes weren't high and the probability low of our victory. But your valleys are where God shows up. That's where God is strong, no matter how weak you feel. And he's going to go before you, even when you lack something that's crucial to staying in the fight.